Well, hello, everybody, and welcome. Want to take a moment and say thank you for joining us on the Faith Ignited podcast and YouTube channel and Facebook, whatever it is you're watching us on. And we are doing a series right now called Unbelievable. And the concept or thinking is that we are covering stories that historically from the Bible are unbelievable. That is kind of the definition of a miracle. But what we want to do is we want to talk about, are they actually believable? And what can we learn from these unbelievable stories? And so last week we covered the story of Jonah and this big giant fish swallowing Jonah and just the fascination of that. And today we are talking about the story of Noah. And so what we want to do is we want to ask this, first of all. What I've done is I put a handful of questions together to just say, hey, can we trust the story of Noah? Should we trust the story of Noah? And what do we take away from the story of Noah? Because quite honestly, the idea that there's this guy whom God called around 3000 BC to build a giant boat and put 2 of every animal in, except for those that he was going to eat, and there he put 7 of them in. It's an amazing story, right? And as Christians, we've got to admit that. We've got to claim it's an amazing story. That's what makes it miraculous, because it doesn't happen every day. And so as Christians, we have to acknowledge this story is almost unbelievable. But the power of the story is that there's evidence to support the story. And the question is, what evidence will you accept if you say, I don't believe in the story of Noah? Again, we often put this in the lineup of fairy tales and fables. But is it meant to be there? Or is it meant to be a historical account? So let's start with the first question. What does the story of Noah teach us about God, if it's true? Because I want to start here because, again, there's a point in the story being in the scripture, not just as it to tell us history, but God is making a point. So what does the story of Noah reveal? The story of Noah reveals that, well, it is by faith that we are saved, not by our good works. What I mean by that is, in the midst of the story of judgment against the world has turned so evil that God actually grieves the fact that he created humanity. He regrets it. His heart is broken. And again, we see a God who interacts with humanity, not the divine watchmaker who wound it up and set it into motion and then left it alone. We see from Scripture that there is a God who is interactive with the story of humanity and is full of compassion and grace. So much so that when humanity has chosen to disobey God, his heart is actually broken. And where God could and should say, fine, do away with you, whatever you want, go have whatever you want. What God does is he says, I am going to work to win the heart of my people back. And so it's a story of grace in the midst of judgment, because God doesn't have to save Noah. God reveals that Noah was someone who, because of his trust, because of his faith in God, God chose to save. In fact, Genesis 6:8 says, but Noah found favor in God's eyes. And it's important just to recognize what we're talking about here, because the idea that Noah found favor in God's eyes, it doesn't say that he earned it, that he did X amount of good works, that he achieved any kind of status, that he was more righteous than anybody else. It simply suggests that Noah trusted God, that he still listened to God. And this is important, because someone might argue, well, why did God pick Noah? Well, I don't think God picked Noah. I think God was speaking to everyone just as he is today. Why? Because I know the character of God, who's calling everyone to him just as he is today, but he doesn't force anyone to be in relationship with him. So if you want to reject God, you have the right to reject God, and you can reject God, and God won't force you to be in relationship with him. And so God wasn't forcing anyone to be in relationship with him, but Noah chose to be in relationship with God. Noah chose to listen to the voice of God. So the story is that Noah is rescued. He's saved because of his trust in God. Not because he was a good man, not because he did good works, not because he earned it, but because he trusted. He believed in God. He had faith in God. All right, so let's talk about the can we trust the story of Noah and some of the questions that we pull from the story. And because there are many things, because it's a story, it's history, we can say, oh, I learned this, I know this, I know this, I know this. But can we trust the story? So the first argument would be science says you can't trust the story of Noah. Well, the reality of it is science doesn't say anything. Scientists do. In fact, what's interesting about the story of Noah is that with most biblical stories, there are credible scientists on both sides of the story of Noah. This group over here is saying, hey, there's no way this can happen. This group over here is saying, hey, there's plenty of good evidence for the story of Noah. There's plenty of good evidence that suggests not that it did happen, but that it could happen. And I think that's an important distinction to make. Science, again, doesn't prove the story of Noah, nor does it disprove the story of Noah. It just gives evidence that it is possible that the story of Noah happened. Now, here's the important piece we've got to remember, is that the scripture talks about a worldwide flood. And a lot of people have said, hey, look, there's just no evidence for a worldwide flood, therefore the story of Noah can't be real. Well, here's what you've got to understand, is that the biblical writers, while writing on behalf of God, were still human. And so when Scripture says in Genesis that there was a worldwide flood, it doesn't necessarily have to encompass the entire world. It can be the world that the writers knew of, or the world that humanity knew of. And what we have is we have amazing, credible evidence for a flood, all right, around it's easy to say that word, Mesopotamian Valley, which was where humanity was gathered, all of humanity, in fact, around the time of 3000 BC. Around the time of 3000 BC. In fact, Dr. Robert Ballard, he's the guy that discovered the Titanic in 1985, has spent some time searching the Black Sea. And what he has discovered is about 300 feet below the sea level was evidence that the Black Sea was once fresh water, but then flooded with salt water. So 300 feet below the sea level of today. And he says that there's a shoreline there that dates somewhere between 3000 and 5000 BC, about the time of Noah. Now again, this doesn't prove Noah or the ark story. It only proves that the area where civilization was and started once had much less water than currently has, and experienced several amazing floods, or at least one amazing flood that even turned an area that was fresh water and rose the level of sea there 300 feet. Now, that's an amazing amount of water, by the way, just in case you're ever wondering. To raise the sea level 300 feet, all right, is incomprehensible for me to even imagine 300 feet of water, that much water rising. Again, it doesn't prove the story of Noah. It just says that, hey, at one point in time, there was less water in the area than there is today. So, next question. All right, as you, again, just look at the story of Noah and say, hey, here are some questions that I have. Why would God send a flood to kill all the people? They weren't that bad, were they? Well, I would suggest to you that, first of all, if we make the statement they weren't that bad, it suggests that we don't understand the nature of sin, nor the morality and perfection of God, or the love of God. You see, to say that people weren't that bad, well, any sin is bad, and any sin is corrupt, and therefore leads to death, leads to the destruction of the relationship with God, or is the destruction of the relationship with God. So to say, why would God send a flood to kill all those people? Well, if we read the account in Genesis, we come to discover, hey, humanity had become absolutely corrupt. Genesis 6:1. When human beings began to increase in number, we're going to go all the way to verse 5. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on earth, and that listen to this, every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Only evil all the time. Now, None of us were alive. None of us were there. Nobody documented what was going on. There's no written records to say, hey, between 5,000 and 3,000 BC, this is what was going on. But to say that every thought and inclination of the human heart was evil all the time is an amazing statement, and suggests, again, a life, humanity that we can't comprehend. Right? Because, we experience evil here and here and here, and it's a big deal, and that's why it gets on the news. But when rape, when murder, when things like the Holocaust, the trials and the experimentation on people, when the brutality of humanity reaches a level that the things that make our news today wouldn't even make news, that is a time period that we're understanding is going on with Noah. Okay, that murder, rape, experimenting on humans, it just brutality. It isn't even newsmaker, right? It's just, hey, this is how the world lives. This is the way things are all the time. And then God regrets, all right, the relationship he has with humans. And it says that God regrets that he even made humans. His heart is, listen to the word, broken. His heart is broken. Now, when we use these words to describe God, we have to remember that we're using human words to describe what God is feeling. But it's a way for God to say, hey, this is what I was working through. And it doesn't mean that God was surprised at what happened. It doesn't mean that God was like, oh my gosh, I didn't see this coming. All right. It simply is an account of us trying to understand why God sent the flood. All right. Now, why would God kill all those people? Why? Maybe the question actually would be, is it fair for God to kill all the people? And so here is God's judgment fair? Which is a great question, and one that we need to ask. And again, as Christians, we have to engage in these conversations, because these are the questions that your friends, my friends, are asking before they're going to get to Jesus. Often these are the blocks that are between them and the logic and the reasonable faith, is to just go, yeah, I want to believe in Jesus. I like the Jesus guy, but I also can't believe in the loving Jesus when this is a story about your loving Jesus. I can't put the two together. Well, let's start. Is God's judgment fair? Well, fair by whose standards? Who is judging? Are we judging God, or is God judging us? And we all judge all the time. We judge that behavior is right, that behavior is wrong, that's safe to do that, that's not safe to do that, right? But where do we get the standards to judge? Listen, unless our morality comes from an objective outside deity, it will always be changing and will always be determined by might. And what I mean by that is, unless our moral standards come from an outside divine source, they'll always be determined by the most powerful bully. Let me say that again. Unless our moral standards come from an outside divine source, they will always be determined by the most powerful bully. And here's the idea, that right and wrong will always be determined by who is the strongest, who is the most mighty, who's the one that can beat everybody else up. That will be the person who ultimately determines what right and wrong is, unless there is a moral, objective standard from a divine individual outside of you and me, outside of creation. In fact, Revelation 13 says about this moral standard and the need for something that is outside of the bully concept, outside of our world. It says, hey, there's going to be a day when the beast comes and he's going to reign on earth, and people will worship this beast, this dragon, because he is the most powerful being, all right? And so there's the idea that in the future there'll be a being that is very strong, very powerful. He's able to do miraculous things, and people will worship him and will choose him as the leader of what's right and wrong because he's the most powerful, not because there's right and wrong. That's the judgment that's coming. And that's the world that we would live in unless we stop and say, all right, where do we get our moral standards? Is there right and wrong beyond my opinion? Now, why is that important? Well, because if we're going to judge God, we got to go, all right, by what standards do we judge God's behavior in Genesis was right or wrong? Well, we judge God's behavior by what standards? By God's standards. that means that it's hard to say, God, you're wrong because it's by your standards we judge. Again, we just don't take sin or corruption as serious as God does. We don't take sin or corruption as serious as God does. But let me move the question into kind of more practical, more everyday applications, right? Because what I really hear my friends saying when they say, hey, was God right killing all those people? Is they're asking, does God have the right to take a life? Or does God have a right to murder? Well, God doesn't murder. God's simply moving someone from one place of existence to another. Now, that's not a cop-out. That's a simple recognition of God's God. God created life. Only God can resurrect life. Therefore, God owns all life. He owns all creation. When he decides someone dies, and when they live, it's in God's privy. It's in God's right as the creator and sustainer of all life. Then when God takes a life, in the sense of they die, he's just moving them from one place of existence to the next. You and I don't have the ability to do that. It may be what happens, right? But that's not within our ability. We didn't give the life. We don't have the ability to resurrect the life. We don't own creation. Only God does. So does God have the right to take a life? Well, yes, only God has the right to take a life in that sense, that God is the one that can, again, create life, resurrect life, and move life on. But again, to say, hey, does God have the right to do that? We're now judging God. We're saying, hey, God, I deem you as inappropriate. I deem that you exercised inappropriate behavior using inappropriate standards when you took this life. And often we hear this referred to from people, citing Deuteronomy and the killing of the Canaanites. And again, we have the story where the Canaanites are sacrificing babies to the god Molech, and here we have people who argue against God and God's judgment, who are also the ones who argue against God and God's lack of judgment when God doesn't step in and stop evil. So I don't believe in God because he doesn't stop evil, but I don't believe in God because when he does stop evil, I deem it unfair. You with me? Let me say that again, because this is huge. I don't believe in God because he doesn't stop evil. But I also don't believe in God because when he does stop evil, I deem it unfair. And again, hear that. I deem it. All right? I'm the one who now judges God and the behavior. And so we end up in this circle where someone who says, I'm not going to believe in God because either he has judged or I'm not going to believe in God because he does judge, just continues to run in a circle where what they're really saying is, I don't like God. They're not really making a truth claim about God. They're just saying, I don't like God. And often, at the end of the day, when you climb into what they're really saying is I don't want God to be in charge of my morality. I want the ability to be in charge. I want the ability to make up the rules, which is fascinating because ultimately this is the same sin, the original sin committed in the Garden of Eden, right? Adam and Eve are tempted by the serpent who says, if you eat this fruit, you will be like God. You will be independent. You won't be dependent on God. You'll be able to make your own decisions. All right. Question number 2. How could God kill innocent children in the flood? They didn't do anything wrong. Fair enough. Well, let me just make a couple statements. If the violence and in the time of Noah, if things are really as bad as the scriptures say they were, you know what? To take kids to heaven, what God may have been doing is actually sparing them from the torture and trials of living on that earth. So maybe God's action was an act of mercy and grace. Again, the idea that God's killing innocent children, though, there's nobody innocent. There's nobody good. And again, what we see here is that Scripture says there's an age of accountability. And in that, there's an understanding that children go to heaven regardless of where they're at, because, again, they're just not accountable for their own beliefs and what they trust yet. They just Mom and dad did it, and I got to trust what mom and dad do. And if mom and dad teach the wrong thing, then again, they're accountable to God for teaching the wrong thing and raising their children to believe the wrong thing, but the children aren't accountable for what they believe yet. So how could God kill the innocent children? Well, remember, there's no one innocent. It is perhaps, if the world is as evil as it is, that God was giving a gift of grace to children. And again, when I say that, what we have to remember is that this life on earth isn't all there is. In fact, this life on earth, if you've lived very long, you know that it's full of pain and anguish. And we live in a society that has rules and justice and governance and right concepts and virtue and honor. But if things are as bad as in the time of Noah as what Scripture says it is, these kids were being raised in a torturous society. All right. So next one. Why would God kill the animals because of man's action? Well, Scripture suggests that in the Garden of Eden, or says in the Garden of Eden, that when Adam and Eve sinned, that all creation became contaminated with sin. That it was an ecological sin that affected everything. All of a sudden, thistles and weeds are growing up where they're meant to not have weeds, and again, it's just bad for everything. And so, because of our sin, the world suffered. This still goes on today with our pollutants and the way we care for the world because of our sin. Again, God told Adam and Eve and told humanity, you are to be caretakers of this world. And when we don't behave that way, all the animals suffer. So the idea that animals are dying because of man's or humanity's actions, that's still going on today. Let me one more. How did Noah, what is the question? Okay. Was Noah saved because he was a good man, or was he saved because God declared he was a good man? And here I think the heart of the question is really like, again, did God choose Noah, or was Noah already good and therefore God said, hey, you've earned the right to be on this boat? Well, it says that Noah found favor in God's eyes. And while we touched on this at the beginning, again, I just kind of want to come back and wrap everything up with this, that finding favor in God's eyes is an important way to phrase that, which is why Scripture does it, because it doesn't mean that Noah earned it. Now, why is this important in the story of Noah, and why are we concluding with this? Well, because you and I can't earn God's favor. Why is that important? Because you and I can't unearn God's favor. It doesn't say that God hated the rest of humanity, and that's why they got destroyed. It says that they behaved in such a way that it was so evil that God regretted it. It broke God's heart. And that there was no one else who was listening to the voice of God except Noah. That is a powerful culture, that there's only one person and his family and an entire creation that listens to the voice of God, who found favor. Again, he didn't earn it. He found favor because why? He trusted God. And what is the evidence for this statement that I'm making? Why do I make the statement the way I did? Well, because there's this moment where God calls Noah to build an ark. Now, Noah's sitting there. There's no rain. There's no clouds in sight. And God says, I'm going to give you this plan to build something that's so big, that's so amazing, no one will ever believe it. It's going to take you maybe a couple years to build. That is an amazing amount of faith, an amazing amount of trust in God. And you can see Noah's neighbors coming over and laughing at him as he's building the ark and teasing him, right? What? Because they're saying, Noah, you are a crazy dude. This is ridiculous. Noah, give up. You're working so hard. Noah, your God's false. Noah, your God is evil. He just wants to see you suffer. Then Noah, by faith, by trust, builds the ark. Now that's an amazing amount of trust. Again, he didn't earn it. And by the way, we have a God who could have just snapped his fingers and the ark would have been built. All right, it just could have come into, there it is, in existence, right? Because we have a God who does the miraculous. So what is the point of God inviting Noah to build the ark? It's building that trust. It's building that character. And as those neighbors come and they criticize Noah and they haggle Noah and maybe throw things at Noah and his family, what is being built inside Noah? Well, through tribulation, a rock solid, firm faith is being built in the character of Noah to believe in God. What's being built in you? What's God doing with you? What is God doing that everyone else would criticize? Hey, let me conclude with the most important thing then. You ready? First of all, our faith isn't built and founded on the story of Noah or the fish or even creation. Our faith is founded on an event and a person. The person is Jesus Christ. The resurrection is the event. But it is because that Jesus referenced Noah and believed in Noah and the flood story that I believe in it. Why? Because, you ready? Anytime someone can predict their own death and resurrection and pull it off, we should do and believe whatever they say. So when it comes to the story of Noah, I'm a believer. Why? Because Jesus believed in it. And Jesus said, no one's good except the Father. No one comes unto the Father except me. I am the giver of grace. I am the giver of all good things. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Hey guys, thanks for joining us today. I hope this helped you understand a bit of the story of Noah. If you have more questions, send them to us through Facebook or through text or through our website, www.faithignited.info. And you can check out more information and more podcasts and more videos on our YouTube channel. And we have all kinds of ways for you to resource your faith so that you can engage others in conversations that help move them closer to Jesus and help remove the walls that are between them and the logic of believing in Jesus and putting their trust in Jesus for eternity. I'll see you next week, guys. Have a blessed day.